To comprehend the sheer scale of the Astra Militarum is to invite madness into the fragile mortal mind. Across the million scattered worlds of the Emperor's realm, the concept of human attrition does not exist as a tragedy. It exists merely as a foundational pillar of cold, unfeeling logistics. Within the Cyclopean archives of the Adeptus Administratum on Holy Terra, the annihilation of 1 billion souls is recorded without a single tear. Entire generations are reduced to a solitary drop of black ink upon an endless ledger of dried parchment. Flesh and bone are transmuted into pure, uncompromising mathematics. In the darkened nightmare of the 41st millennium, a single mortal life possesses absolutely no inherent value. It is a cheap currency to be spent in the grinding machinery of galactic survival. Men and women are harvested from the dirt solely to feed an uncaring meat grinder that spans the frozen void of the cosmos. Among these countless forgotten statistics was Private Nemen Rauth. There was nothing chosen or destined about this frightened man. He possessed no heroic lineage, no latent psychic gift, and no towering courage to speak of. He was utterly unexceptional, a terrified youth stripped from a decaying hab block and pressed hastily into the coarse fatigues of the Imperial Guard. Rauth was entirely insignificant, a trembling equation in the calculus of blood waiting to be balanced out by violent death. His initiation into the true horror of this universe began in the dark, trembling belly of an atmospheric dropship. The descent toward a nameless, bitterly contested mud world was an absolute sensory violation. The transport vessel screamed as it tore through the turbulent clouds, its armored hull groaning under the immense stress of a terminal velocity plunge. Inside the claustrophobic troop compartment, the air was suffocatingly thick. It reeked of stale sweat, regurgitated rations, and the harsh chemical sting of unburnt promethium. Rauth sat shoulder to shoulder with trembling conscripts he barely knew, all of them vibrating with the violent shudder of the planetary descent. Sanguine emergency lumens bathed the terrified ranks in the color of the slaughter that awaited them below. No inspiring speeches were given over the rattling Vox networks. There was only the deafening roar of the plasma engines and the rhythmic metallic clatter of hundreds of cheap laser guns shaking in the hands of doomed men. When the heavy landing ramps finally slammed open into the churning grey mud, the universe exploded into a cacophony of indiscriminate slaughter. There was no glorious vanguard charge, only a frantic, blinding stumble into a maelstrom of searing energy and deafening concussions. Before Rauth could even plant his heavy boots upon the wretched Xenos Earth, the men to his immediate left and right simply ceased to be. They were violently erased into wet clouds of crimson mist and shattered bone by intersecting arcs of heavy enemy fire. In such an unforgiving crucible, merely surviving a single day is a profound statistical anomaly. Yet as the thick cordite smoke momentarily parted over the flooded trench lines, Private Rauth found himself miraculously whole. He stood paralyzed in the knee-deep muck, drenched in the fresh blood of his fallen peers. He had somehow endured his first agonizing brush with annihilation, leaving him to stare down at the desperately inadequate tools the Imperium had given him to wage its endless war. To comprehend the survival of guardsman Nemen Rauth is to understand the absolute inadequacy of the war gear strapped to his trembling frame. The Departamento Munitorum equips its tithed billions with standard-issue flak armor. This rigid carapace of stamped plasteel and thermal-absorbent weave is a triumph of industrial logistics rather than a testament to martial protection. It is designed to be manufactured by the trillions across the sprawling assembly lines of 1,000 choking hive worlds. Against the jagged iron shrapnel of a distant artillery strike, or the low-velocity impacts of primitive kinetic firearms, it performs adequately. It provides the fresh recruit with a comforting illusion of invulnerability. Yet in the crucible of a true galactic theatre, it is nothing more than a burial shroud waiting to be sealed. When struck by the mass-reactive fury of an Astartes bolter shell, the Plasteel shatters inward, turning the armor itself into a secondary source of lethal, bone-shredding fragmentation. Against the searing, unleashed starfire of Xenos plasma weaponry, the composite layers simply vaporize, taking the mortal flesh beneath with them in an agonizing flash of blinding light. Before the monomolecular scythes of Tyranid talons or the crude, rusted cleavers of an orc brute, standard flak armor offers no more physical resistance than wet parchment. In Rauth's bloodied hands rests the iconic instrument of Imperial authority, the M36 Cantrael pattern laser gun. It is a marvel of brutal utilitarianism, possessing virtually no moving parts to jam or degrade in the toxic, corrosive mud of Xenos battlefields. Its focusing crystals are robust, its power packs can be recharged in the blazing heat of an open campfire, and its composite casing can withstand the crushing treads of an armored transport. Yet for all its vaunted mechanical reliability, it fires mere pulses of coherent light against abominations born of the immaterium and leviathans bred for planetary consumption. The sheer cosmic horror of the galaxy renders the laser gun an instrument of agonizing futility when wielded by a lone, unaugmented human. It is a weapon engineered to be fired in synchronized volleys of 10,000, overwhelming impossible odds through the sheer, sacrificial mathematics of Imperial attrition. A single last bolt might singe the outer chitin of a void predator, but it takes a blinding wall of searing crimson energy to actually halt its murderous charge. This is the bitter, unspoken truth of the Astra Militarum. The Imperium does not arm its soldiers to ensure their survival, but merely to ensure they can inflict a fractional toll before they are inevitably consumed by the dark. There is a profound, sickening juxtaposition in sending a fragile, bleeding mortal into the howling void, defended by nothing but cheap stamped alloys, a beam of focused light, and an ironclad faith in the master of mankind. Rauth recognizes this terrifying reality with every pull of his trigger and every ozone-scented discharge of his rifle. He clutches this hopelessly outclassed weaponry as he descends into the atmospheric fires of his 20th combat drop, then his 30th, then his 40th. His armor bears the deep, jagged gouges of glancing blows and the scorched carbon scarring of near misses. He breathes miraculously unharmed in body, while the men and women standing directly to his left and his right are repeatedly reduced to steaming viscera and scattered ash. The cheap plasteel plates strapped to his chest have outlived their calculated statistical lifespan by decades. He holds an immortal, mass-produced weapon in mortal hands, acutely aware that the war gear of the Imperial Guard was never designed to save the soldier. By the 50th deployment, the flak armor and standard issue las guns of the Astra Militarum were already proven to be little more than burial shrouds. Yet Nemen Rauth continued to drop into the fires of damnation. From the 50th descent to the 100th, his regiment was subjected to a complete and merciless turnover. He stood in the mud and the blood as the meatgrinder of the 41st millennium claimed every soul assigned to his flank. Veteran sergeants who had survived a dozen campaigns were reduced to fine red mist by artillery barrages. Hardened corporals were torn asunder by chain axes, their screams cut short in a symphony of gore. Fresh conscripts, trembling youths who had never seen the stars, were turned to ash by plasma fire before they could even utter a prayer to the God Emperor. Rauth watched them all perish. He breathed the smoke of their immolation and tasted the copper of their spilled life. Through it all, a dark and terrible miracle occurred. While the men and women around him were rendered down to meat and memory, Rauth remained perfectly unblemished. Not a single burn scorched his flesh. Not a single shrapnel scar marked his face. He was coated entirely in the grime of the battlefield, painted in the ashes of his comrades, yet he did not bleed. In a sane universe, this would be a cause for profound gratitude. In the cruel domain of the Imperium, mourning is a heresy of wasted time, and surviving when so many others perish is a luxury that breeds only paranoia. To live while thousands die is to invite the most dangerous kind of scrutiny. A soldier of the Imperial Guard is born to die in service to the Golden Throne. To defy that fate again and again is to defy the very machinery of human existence. The weight of the dead began to crush his mind. Rauth became a man trapped within a waking nightmare, burdened by the ghosts of 100 perished squads. When he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow faces of the dead demanding to know why he was spared. When he opened them, he saw new replacements marching into the very same slaughter, oblivious to the spectral throng that marched beside them. He could not wake up from this torment. Worse still, he could not die. The master of mankind seemed to actively deny him the peace of the grave, locking him in a purgatory of perpetual survival. His existential horror grew with every drop, hollowing out his humanity until only an empty vessel of duty remained. He was a ghost, walking among the soon-to-be dead. Such an anomaly cannot exist in the darkness of the galaxy without drawing attention. The ledger of lives spent and lives preserved is watched closely by men of harsh faith and merciless judgment. The statistical impossibility of one unscarred guardsman enduring 100 suicidal drops was no longer a mere battlefield legend. It was a glaring irregularity in the grand tithe of blood. Cold eyes in high places began to turn away from the strategic maps and focus instead upon the unnatural endurance of Nemen Rauth. Where a lesser command might have seen a hero blessed by the heavens, the cruel bureaucracy of the Inquisition saw only a profound and terrifying shadow. To survive 100 combat drops is a miracle of the God Emperor. To survive 200 is a mathematical impossibility. When the veteran trooper Rauth crossed that sacred and terrible threshold, he did not receive medals or parades. He received the unblinking, paranoid gaze of the commissariat. In the grim darkness of the far future, perfection is never viewed as a virtue. It is the highest form of suspicion. An unblemished skin and a pristine survival record do not speak of martial supremacy to the internal policing organs of the Imperium. They whisper of chaotic taint, of forbidden warp sorcery, or of a cowardly pact made in the dark. Humanity survives through the relentless grinding of the meatgrinder, and a cog that refuses to wear down must surely be forged of heretical iron. Rauth was quietly pulled from the mustering decks by black-coated officers. He offered no resistance to their rough hands. His soul was already crushed by the immense psychological weight of outliving thousands of his brothers. He walked into the shadows willingly, hoping only for the swift mercy of an executioner to grant him the Emperor's peace. Instead, he was dragged into the cold, incense-choked bowels of an Inquisition interrogation vault. For weeks, Rauth was subjected to the most brutal torments the Ordos could devise. His flesh was mapped by invasive Auspex scans, searching for the hidden mutations of the ruinous powers. Sanctioned psychers peeled back the layers of his battered mind, their telepathic probes tearing through his memories to find the stain of the arch-enemy. Inquisitorial acolytes broke his fingers and asked him the same questions 1,000 times. They demanded to know the name of the demon that protected him. They demanded to know how he dared to defy the casualty quotas of the Departamento Munitorum. This is the ultimate paradox of the Imperial war machine. To die for the Emperor is the duty of all, but to survive when the great ledgers of the Munitorum dictate you should be dead is a crime against the grand design. Through the endless agony, Rauth remained horribly, tragically pure. The psychers found only a vast, empty expanse of survivor guilt and apathetic despair. The Auspex scanners found no corruption in his blood, revealing only the chemical remnants of combat stims and profound physical exhaustion. The inquisitorial interrogators, desperate for a reason to put a bolt round through his skull and close the terrifying anomaly, found absolutely nothing. He was no heretic, no sorcerer, and no coward. He was merely a mortal man cursed by an unfathomable alignment of probability. Denied the sweet release of execution, Rauth was absolved of his supposed sins. Yet the Imperium does not waste a miraculous anomaly. If he could not be burned as a traitor, he would be weaponized as an asset. The Inquisition sealed his files and permanently transferred his command out of the standard infantry regiments. He was condemned to a new, far deadlier purpose, stripped of his humanity and reduced to a pure logistical tool. The Inquisition found no taint of the arch-enemy within his soul, yet the Administratum possesses its own merciless machinery. To the unfeeling adepts of the Departamento Munitorum, a soldier is merely a numerical value weighed against the vast calculus of war. They could not execute Rauth for the crime of survival, so they chose instead to weaponize his statistical anomaly. Within the labyrinthine data vaults of the Munitorum, a specialized redeployment edict was quietly forged. Usually, such logistical maneuvers amalgamate broken regiments into new fighting forces to maintain combat efficacy across the front lines. For Rauth, the bureaucracy drafted a fate of profound and suffocating isolation. He was formally excised from the rolls of his founding regiment and reclassified as a singular floating reinforcement asset. He was ordered to plug the bleeding gaps in the line, dispatched alone into squads that had already suffered 90% casualties. The Munitorum cogitators had decreed that his unnatural fortune should be spent in the most horrific meat grinders of the entire campaign. Where the arithmetic of survival reached absolute zero, Rauth was mercilessly deployed. From orbital drop 201 to his 350th insertion, the pattern remained brutally consistent. He would arrive in the shattered remnants of a trench line, his lasgun fully charged and his flak armor perfectly pristine. He would stand among weeping, bleeding veterans who knew exactly what his arrival signified. To be reinforced by the unscratched guardsman was to receive a death sentence signed by the sector command itself. Whispers of his cursed luck spread through the mustering yards and field hospitals like a terrifying contagion. He became a living myth among the mud and the blood, an infallible omen of total annihilation. When his transport touched down in a ruined outpost, the condemned defenders understood instantly that their deployment had been designated a complete loss by the strategos. He was a grim reaper, clad in standard-issue flak armor, a spectre of doom walking through earth-shattering artillery barrages completely untouched. While plasma fire and jagged shrapnel evaporated the men fighting shoulder to shoulder with him, Rauth simply stepped over their pulverized remains to hold the line. He survived every apocalyptic ambush and suicidal bayonet charge, while entire companies were systematically eradicated around him. His localized legend of doom grew so pervasive that political officers threatened to execute men merely for uttering his name in the mess halls. He was a true pariah of the trenches, an isolated ghost tethered to the mortal realm by a curse of absolute invulnerability. Yet the shattered battlefields of his torment were but a minuscule fragment of a much grander tapestry of impending ruin. The logistical adepts of the Munitorum had focused so entirely on the anomaly of one undying guardsman that they failed to process the agonizing screams of the sector astropathic choirs. Deep within the freezing void, an immense shadow was moving across the stars, slowly eclipsing the sacred light of the Astronomicon. An unfathomable cosmic terror was drifting into the system, hungering for the very worlds Rauth had been cursed to walk. But while one man fights his localized war of penance, the cosmos turns its uncaring gaze upon his world. Beyond the isolated tragedies of the human condition, a far older and vastly more terrible truth drifts through the void. It does not come with the hateful screams of the arch-enemy, nor does it march beneath the banners of a rebellious ideology. It simply comes, driven by an imperative as ancient as the stars themselves. A splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Leviathan has breached the sector, reaching out with the grasping, chitinous tendrils of an apex cosmic predator. This is a threat devoid of malice or ambition. It possesses only a boundless, unyielding hunger. To the great devourer, the magnificent cathedrals and sprawling manufactorums of the Imperium are meaningless. Mankind is not an enemy to be conquered, but merely biomass to be consumed and repurposed. Long before the sky darkens with falling mycetic spores, the doom of the sector is heralded by an oppressive psychic phenomenon known as the shadow in the warp. It is a profound and terrifying silence that smothers the immaterial realm. The astro-telepathic choirs, those fragile psychic tethers that bind the Imperium together, are the first to suffer. Imagine a billion voices screaming in perfect, mindless unison, drowning out every desperate plea for salvation. Astropaths clutch their bleeding eyes and tear at their own flesh, driven to complete madness by the Xenos static tearing through their minds. Navigators are blinded, their third eyes burned out by the sheer psychic mass of the approaching swarm. Ships are lost to the shifting tides of the Empyrean, isolated and easy prey. The shadow in the warp is not merely a disruption of communication, but a suffocating weight upon the human soul itself. It is the psychic pressure of trillions upon trillions of Xenos consciousnesses, all bound to the singular will of the hive mind. Citizens who have never shown a trace of psychic talent wake from nightmares soaked in a cold, unnatural sweat, paralyzed by an inescapable sense of dread. The light of the Emperor is blotted out, replaced by a cosmic void that cares nothing for faith, sacrifice, or heroism. The universe is revealed in its truest form. It is cold, hungry, and entirely indifferent to human suffering. Planet after planet falls silent as the Tyranid swarm systematically strips away oceans, atmospheres, and every living cell, leaving behind only dead rocks drifting in the dark. The Imperial sector descends into a chaotic darkness, entirely cut off from the wider galaxy and left to die alone. There will be no reinforcements, no angelic saviors descending from the heavens. In this suffocating isolation, the vast machinery of the Astra Militarum must throw its shattered remnants into the jaws of the swarm. And so the unyielding survivor, Rauth, finds his path converging with the greatest nightmare the galaxy has ever known. He is ordered into the belly of the beast, deployed to the smog-choked surface of a dying hive world that stands directly in the path of the encroaching Xenos maw. Mortis IX was a world already lost before the first boot struck its dying Earth. It was here that Rauth embarked upon his 463rd combat drop. The mega Hive City, once a shimmering monument to human industry, was now firmly in the digestive grip of the Great Devourer. The very atmosphere wept with the corruption of the alien swarm. A diseased, bruised purple hue stained the heavens, entirely blotting out the light of the local star. Monstrous capillary towers, terrible spires of ribbed flesh and pulsing veins, pierced the toxic smog as they aggressively drank the boiling oceans dry. Great spore chimneys erupted from the corrupted crust, violently exhaling geysers of choking, acidic ash that dissolved the lungs of the faithful. Into this nightmare of biological consumption, the Astra Militarum hurled its final, desperate reserves. The descent was an unmitigated slaughter. The heavy Overlord dropships and Valkyrie assault carriers did not plunge through empty airspace, but through a living, writhing ocean of winged horrors. Flocks of gargoyles numbering in the billions choked the upper atmosphere, their leathery wings beating a cacophony of doom against the screaming engines of the Imperial transports. Searing bioplasma and acidic spit filled the air like a typhoon of emerald fire. Around Rauth, transport after transport detonated in spectacular spheres of flame, showering the hive spires below with burning metal and the charred remains of the Emperor's servants. The sky itself was bleeding. Rauth sat perfectly still in the troop compartment as the vessel bucked and screamed under the stress of evasive maneuvers. Then came the inevitable strike. A colossal bioprojectile slammed into the port engine of their dropship, shearing the wing from the fuselage in an explosion of promethium and jagged shrapnel. Gravity asserted its cruel dominance. The transport entered a catastrophic death spiral, tumbling wildly toward the upper spires of the mega hive. The impact was a visceral crescendo of tearing adamantium and shattering glass. The transport slammed into the side of a Gothic cathedral tower, grinding through ancient statuary and Plasteel buttresses before coming to a violent, shuddering halt deep within the ruined architecture. Silence fell over the mangled troop compartment, broken only by the hiss of venting coolant and the dripping of vital fluids. Inside the crumpled shell of the transport, the devastation was absolute. The brutal deceleration and the twisting of the hull had transformed the interior into a slaughterhouse. Every single guardsman of Rauth's newly assigned squad had been liquefied within their crash webbing, their bodies reduced to an indistinguishable mass of broken bone and pulped flesh. Yet amidst this macabre tableau, Rauth calmly reached forward and unbuckled his heavy restraint harness. He stepped out of the twisted wreckage entirely unharmed, without a single scratch upon his armor or a drop of blood upon his skin. The Emperor's dark grace had spared him once again. He stood alone at the precipice of the failing Hive City, a solitary shadow surrounded by untold millions of ravenous Xenos. Beneath him stretched the abyssal depths of the Underhive, a labyrinth of shadows where the vanguard of the swarm was already waiting. The underlevels of the Hive City have become a crucible of biological perfection. The vanguard of the Great Devourer does not conquer with the crude machineries of mankind, but with the immaculate geometries of bone and chitin. Gin stealers tear through the ventilation arteries like fluid nightmares, their scything talons parting plasteel and flesh with identical ease. Above them, in the vaulted shadows of the manufactorum ceilings, lictors hang suspended in terrifying silence. Their chameleonic skin ripples to match the rusted bulkheads and dripping promethium pipes. They are the invisible eyes of the hive mind, apex predators woven from the dark itself. Where they step, no echo falls. Where they strike, only the dead remain. The local planetary defense forces are butchered in the lightless corridors. Their laser guns flash like dying sparks against an overwhelming tide of ribbed carapaces and void black eyes. Squads are dismantled in absolute silence, their desperate screams choked out by the crushing embrace of flesh hooks and rending claws. Blood rains down through the iron grates, pooling in the lower catacombs where the true slaughter unfolds. Against this flawless anatomy of murder, mortal valor is a pathetic irrelevance. Amidst this machinery of extinction walks Rauth, a profoundly fragile vessel of mortal meat and brittle bone. He is a meaningless speck caught in the grinding teeth of a galactic predator, yet he continues to breathe. He does not survive through the martial prowess of a hero, nor the augmented reflexes of a transhuman. He navigates the suffocating dark, guided by an inexplicable, almost passive intuition. He turns his shoulder to the left, and a fraction of a second later, a serrated limb cleaves the empty air to his right. He pauses to rack a fresh power cell into his weapon, and in that exact heartbeat, a roving patrol of 6-limbed killers scuttles past the intersection, entirely unaware of his presence. He ducks beneath a severed conduit, missing the venomous spit of a hidden beast by the width of a single hair. It is as though an unseen hand guides his boots, finding the only safe path through a labyrinth of certain death. He is a ghost, walking among monsters, a living glitch in the synaptic calculations of the swarm. Every shadow around him writhes with the endless hunger of the Xenos brood. The Hive City is drowning in its own blood, the mortal defenders broken and consumed by the millions. The Tyranid vanguard has prepared the feast, and the world is primed for digestion. Rauth presses onward through the gore-slicked corridors, numb to the dying throes of his home. The slaughter is absolute, a flawless execution of the Xenos' will. But the dominion of the Xenos is about to be violently challenged. Far above the smog-choked spires and the dying screams of the populace, the atmosphere itself begins to tear open. The rusted sky of the Underhive tore open with the fury of a dying star. Meteorites of blackened ceramite and burning iron smashed through the hab blocks, vaporizing ferrocrete and Xenos flesh alike in their apocalyptic descent. Where the lone survivor, Rauth, had fought a desperate war of inches in the shadows, The very architecture of the city now gave way to the Emperor's ultimate wrath. The drop pods deployed their assault ramps with the shriek of explosive bolts, venting hyper-pressurized steam into the blood-soaked air. From that artificial fog emerged the Adeptus Astartes. Clad in the midnight armor of the Deathwatch, they were the silver-armed executioners of the Xenos, forged in the darkest secrets of the Inquisition. To Rauth, bleeding and exhausted, the sight of them triggered an ancient primal terror buried deep within the human genome. Scholars of the great librariums call it transhuman dread. It is the profound psychological paralysis that seizes a mortal mind when confronted by a being of such impossible proportions, moving with such fluid, blinding speed. They were giants of ceramite and plasteel, broad as dreadnoughts, yet they did not lumber. They flowed through the ruined plaza with the terrifying grace of apex predators, bridging the gap to the Tyranid swarms before mortal eyes could track their advance. Rauth could only watch, his breath caught in his throat, as the true masters of war began their work. The cavernous ruins echoed with the rhythmic, concussive thunder of their mass-reactive bolters. These were not the crude stub weapons of the planetary defense forces. Each heavy round was a miniature engine of obliteration, detonating deep within the chitinous armor of the Tyranid vanguard. Torsos burst into showers of violet ichor and jagged bone. Scything talons that had butchered hundreds of guardsmen were shattered into useless fragments in a fraction of a second. The Deathwatch did not waste a single movement, nor a single round of ammunition. They were a perfectly synchronized machine of hyper-lethal violence, entirely indifferent to the endless horde surrounding them. Their focus was singular and absolute. They had not come to save the Hive City, nor to rescue the scattered remnants of its mortal population. They had come to sever the head of the serpent. Deep within the breeding pools of the infestation, a monstrous synapse creature orchestrated the swarm, radiating Xenos malice. The kill team carved a bloody path directly toward it, acting as the scalpel in a brutal, planetary decapitation strike. Rauth understood then that he had not been saved, but merely caught in the slipstream of descending gods. As the armored giants pushed deeper into the Xenos tide, leaving a carpet of shattered Xenos corpses in their wake, the mortal survivor realized his only chance at seeing another dawn lay in following the path of their destruction. He tightened his grip on his weapon and stepped out from the shadows, his destiny now inextricably bound to the bloody crusade of the Emperor's angels. Deep within the choked iron arteries of the Manufactorum sector, mortal frailty converged with transhuman wrath. The angels of death had already carved their domain into the chitinous hordes, establishing a grim supremacy paid for in depleted bolt shells and severed limbs. Into this arena of shattered plasteel and steaming viscera walked Rauth. The resulting contrast was a profound testament to the absurd and cruel scales of galactic warfare. Before him stood the Adeptus Astartes, towering demigods of battle clad in thick ceramite plating. Their massive frames bore the savage topography of endless close-quarters slaughter. Deep gouges scarred their ancient armor, and their gene-forged bodies bled rapid, clotting blood that sealed over the cracked ceramite. They were battered titans, heavily damaged, yet entirely unbroken. Then there was Rauth. He was a mere man of brittle bone and frail gristle, coated in the pale, suffocating dust of a dying world. He possessed no genetic augmentations, no blessed power armor, and no arcane weaponry. Most unsettling of all, this mortal was inexplicably devoid of a single laceration. The machine spirits of the Astartes battleplate hummed with cold, clicking scrutiny. Auspex scanners immediately swept over the solitary silhouette, their combat cogitators struggling to reconcile the impossible data. A baseline human surviving alone at the absolute epicenter of a major Tyranid infestation was an affront to probability. The Auspex suites registered him not as a miraculous survivor, but as a staggering glitch in the chaotic arithmetic of the war zone. The Astartes commander peered down at the dusty mortal through glowing crimson retinal lenses. In the hardened gaze of a space marine, there is no room for mortal awe, pity, or compassion. The giant did not view Rauth as an equal, a brother, or a victim requiring salvation. He saw only a tactical anomaly. Rauth was perceived merely as a discarded instrument of the master of mankind, a curious weapon found resting inexplicably in the darkest depths of the forge. If the God Emperor had seen fit to preserve this fragile flesh against all known laws of attrition, the Astartes commander would not question the utility of the divine design. No grand words of rescue were offered. No gesture of comfort or protection was extended by the giants. The commander simply turned his massive, pauldron-clad shoulders back toward the descending abyss. The kill team resumed their relentless, grinding march, operating as a synchronized engine of destruction, pushing ever deeper into the suffocating darkness. Their singular objective remained the apex beast, the monstrous Hive tyrant whose synaptic shadow currently choked the lower levels. Without hesitation, Rauth fell into step behind the striding behemoths. He became a silent ghost, trailing in the wake of walking tanks, matching his fragile mortal cadence to their earth-shattering footfalls. The towering demigods parted the endless sea of Xenos nightmares, and the unscarred man followed silently in their bloody undertow. United by nothing but their forward momentum, this impossible vanguard began their precipitous descent into the most lethal depths of the Hive City. To breach the inner sanctum of a Tyranid infestation is to walk willingly into the maw of a dying god. The kill team plunged deeper into the capillary arteries of the Hive ship, marching relentlessly toward the pulsing thrum of the synapse node. Resistance escalated from mere feral aggression to a coordinated malignant fury. A tidal wave of chitin and flesh surged from the shadows to crush the intruders. Hormagaunts bounded forward in a shrieking flood, their scything talons a blur of biological butchery. Behind them marched the Tyranid warriors, towering monstrosities of muscle and bone that directed the swarm with monstrous psychic will. The clash was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Bolter rounds detonated inside Xenos carapaces, showering the corridor in caustic ichor and shattered bone. Yet the sheer mass of the Great Devourer could not be halted by firepower alone. The spatial dynamic of the corridor devolved into a suffocating meat grinder. The Astartes formed a moving bastion of adamantium and ceramite, but even the Emperor's finest could not weather such a storm unscathed. Bioplasma blasts seared through the gloom, turning the air to fire and melting ancient power armor into slag. Battle Brothers took devastating hits. Ceramite cracked under the sheer kinetic force of massive bone-forged blades. Limbs were severed in fountains of transhuman blood, yet the Space Marines fought on in glorious, violent defiance. A severed arm did not stop a warrior from driving his combat blade into a shrieking throat. They were falling one by one, grinding their lives into dust to buy another yard of ground. Protected within the center of this collapsing ring of giants stood the mortal guardsman known as Rauth. He did not cower. He did not pray. He raised his standard-issue lasgun and fired methodically into the rushing tide of horrors. The slaughter raged just inches from his unarmored face. It was here that the spatial paradox of the battlefield revealed itself. A storm of hypervelocity flesh-borer beetles and venomous spines filled the air, thick enough to eclipse the meager light. Every single projectile missed the mortal by mere millimeters. Caustic acid splashed against the boots of the dying giants around him, yet not a single drop scorched his fatigues. Scything talons swung with enough force to decapitate a space marine, carving through the empty air mere fractions of an inch from Rauth as the beasts blindly prioritized the transhuman threat. He stood perfectly unharmed in the epicenter of absolute annihilation. Through the haze of battle and the blinding pain of their own grievous wounds, the surviving Astartes witnessed this impossible phenomenon. They saw the swarm behaving in a way that defied all tactical logic and biological instinct. The Xenos beasts were not simply missing their shots due to the chaos of the melee. The ravenous horde, driven by an overriding synaptic imperative to extinguish the transhuman threat, was blindly bypassing the fragile human to hurl themselves at the Astartes. It was an unconscious systemic aversion rippling through the synaptic web of the Tyranid forces. The hive mind itself seemed to be rejecting his presence. The angels of death watched a mortal man walk untouched through the shadow of the abyss, and they realized that something far older and darker than the great devourer lingered within his soul. To understand the miraculous survival of a solitary mortal amidst the slaughter of demigods, one must comprehend how the great devourer perceives the material realm. The hive mind does not see the galaxy through the limited lens of emotion, hatred, or individual malice. It views the universe as an unfathomable matrix of predatory calculus and energetic resonance. When the shadow in the warp descends upon a battlefield, it filters reality through threat signatures and biomass density. The Adeptus Astartes are incandescent beacons in this Xenos sensorium. They radiate immense psychic weight, transhuman vitality, and devastating tactical potential. To the macro-intellect of the swarm, a Space Marine is a high-yield variable that demands immediate, overwhelming eradication. The Hive fleet spawned bespoke horrors solely to extinguish these blazing fires of resistance. Every synapse creature directs the chitinous tide to drown the transhuman threat in a deluge of fangs and scythes. In the cold arithmetic of the Xenos god, the angels of death must be unmade at any cost. But then, there is Rauth. He is merely a mortal man clutching a mass-produced lasgun, encased in flak armor barely thicker than parchment. His soul does not burn with the warp-touched fire of the Emperor's chosen. His physical strength is mathematically irrelevant against the endless swarm. In the hypersensory perception of the hive mind, Rauth does not register as a danger. He is an absolute void of tactical importance. His threat signature is so infinitesimally small that the Xenos intelligence simply filters him out of its combat matrix. Herein lies the darkest irony of his continued existence. What mortal men might call divine providence or miraculous luck is, in truth, the ultimate expression of human insignificance. Rauth is surviving because he is utterly beneath the notice of cosmic gods. The apex horrors of the swarm step over his cowering form to reach the roaring Astartes. The synapse webbing calculates that the immediate annihilation of the Astartes is the absolute priority, completely drowning out the negligible biological signature of one broken guardsman. He is a systemic ghost wandering through a biological targeting engine. He is a rounding error in the brutal mathematics of extinction. His continued breathing is not a triumph of the human spirit, but a testament to his sheer irrelevance in the face of galactic annihilation. Ignored by the great beasts, this singular soldier walks through the valley of death untouched. He is a shadow cast by the dying light of angels, slipping through the blind spots of a perfect predatory machine. While the swarm expends millions of organisms to drag down the last standing giants in ceramite, the irrelevant variable moves ever onward. His absolute insignificance becomes an imperceptible cloak, allowing him to descend unhindered into the suffocating depths of the Xenos structure. The shrieks of dying demigods fade behind him, replaced by the wet, rhythmic breathing of the hive. Ahead of him, the fleshy walls begin to pulse with a sick, organic rhythm. The psychic pressure thickens into a suffocating miasma, drawing him relentlessly toward the terrifying heart of the nesting grounds. The descent into the synapse chamber was a plunge into the very womb of the great devourer. The walls of the cavern did not merely echo with the sounds of battle, they breathed. Rauth and the surviving Space Marines stood before a nightmare rendered in flesh and chitin. Vast embryonic sacs hung from the vaulted ceiling, glistening with noxious amniotic fluids that dripped into bubbling digestion pools below. The air was thick with the stench of hyper-accelerated biology and the coppery tang of spilled blood. Every surface pulsed with a sickening rhythm, connected to the colossal neural network of the Hive fleet. At the center of this biological cathedral stood the apex organism, The Hive Tyrant towered over the Astartes, an unstoppable engine of cosmic malice draped in hardened armor plates. It was flanked by its hulking tyrant guard, blind, indomitable beasts engineered for absolute defense. There was no hesitation, no parley, only the sudden and apocalyptic violence of species survival. The Space Marines charged, bellowing litanies of hate as they threw themselves into the meatgrinder. It was a scene of absolute, uncompromising devastation. Bolter fire detonated against the Tyrant Guard to no avail, the explosive rounds merely chipping away at living shields thicker than ceramite. The clash of melee was a symphony of butchery. Cerulean energy flared and died as master-crafted power swords shattered violently against chitinous bone swords. These were the Emperor's chosen transhuman warriors bred to conquer the stars, but here in the dark, they were being systematically dismantled. The Hive Tyrant moved with a terrifying liquid grace that defied its immense bulk. With a single sweeping strike of its organic weaponry, it sheared through pauldron, flesh and bone, cutting a veteran brother in half. The Astartes fought with the desperate fury of dying gods. Their twin hearts pumped combat stimulants through their veins, their Laraman cells working flawlessly to seal catastrophic wounds, yet their biology was pushed past the absolute breaking point. Rauth watched from the periphery as the angels of death were broken. He saw a Space Marine, his helm crushed and his chest plate caved in by a massive hoof, still thrusting a combat knife into the ankle of a Tyrant Guard until life finally abandoned him. He saw another impaled upon a venom cannon, hoisted into the air as acidic toxins melted his gene-forged organs from the inside out. The transhuman physiology of the Adeptus Astartes was failing, overwhelmed by a predator that possessed millions of years of evolutionary supremacy. The floor of the synapse chamber became slick with the mingled blood of human and Xenos. Every fallen battle brother extracted a grievous toll, buying precious seconds with the currency of their immortal souls. They were dying brutal, heroic deaths, throwing their shattered bodies into the meat of the swarm to drag the apex beasts down. As the last of the Astartes' vanguard fell under a flurry of scything talons, the Hive Tyrant roared its triumph. But in their total destruction, the Emperor's angels had managed to crack the armor of the beast, leaving a solitary bleeding wound in its monstrous chest. The transhuman demigod gave his life to purchase a single sliver of vulnerability. With a roar that defied the suffocating weight of the Xenos hive mind, the Astartes sergeant drove his crackling power sword upward in a final apocalyptic arc, shattering its colossal cranial crest in a spray of corrosive ichor and pulverized bone. Yet the cost of such defiance was absolute. Even as the beast reeled from the catastrophic cranial trauma, its massive scything talon whipped forward, impaling the Space Marine through his ceramite breastplate and lifting his ruined body high into the ash-choked air. The giant died suspended upon the blade of the Leviathan, his hearts pierced and his legendary strength finally extinguished. The Hive Tyrant hurled the broken corpse aside, throwing back its hideous skull to unleash a screech of absolute malice. But the beast was grievously wounded. Its immense psychic aura flickered and died as the crushing agony of its shattered skull forced its synaptic shielding to collapse. The warp-infused barrier that had rendered it practically invincible was gone, leaving its pulsing, exposed brain matter open to the poisoned winds of the battlefield. It stood utterly arrogant, convinced that the demise of the Emperor's angels meant the battle was won. It did not look down. It did not see the lone figure standing amidst the slaughtered gods and towering Xenos carcasses. Guardsman Rauth was nothing but a fragile speck of mortal flesh drowning in a sea of titans. His uniform was ragged, his mortal frame trembling with an exhaustion that reached into his very soul. Yet his hands were steady. He raised his M36 Cantrail pattern lasgun, resting the worn stock against his bruised shoulder. This was a weapon often mocked by the ignorant as a mere flashlight, a mass-produced tool of the expendable masses. Rauth knew better. With methodical precision, he adjusted the power selector, overriding the safety inhibitor to draw the absolute maximum yield from his remaining power cell. The internal capacitors strained against the sudden influx of energy, the focusing crystals burning with a volatile heat that threatened to melt the barrel. The weapon's power selector was forced into absolute overload, channeling the high-capacity last pack into a blinding, continuous volley of maximum yield discharges. Rauth slowed his breathing, narrowing his focus until the nightmare of the roaring battlefield faded into absolute silence. He aligned the iron sights with the gaping, weeping fissure in the armored skull of the beast. The Xenos warlord finally sensed the gathering energy, lowering its monstrous gaze to look upon the insignificant creature it had ignored. It was too late. Rauth pulled the trigger. A blinding spear of highly coherent light erupted from the barrel, a singular lance of concentrated thermal energy that crossed the distance in a fraction of a heartbeat. The overcharged beam struck the exposed cerebral cortex of the Hive tyrant with pinpoint accuracy, flashing the vital brain matter into expanding plasma and explosive steam. The colossal predator froze, its four arms twitching violently as catastrophic neurological death cascaded through its nervous system. With a horrific groan of collapsing muscle and crushing mass, the towering executioner toppled backward and crashed heavily to the blasted earth. Instantly, the oppressive psychic weight of the synaptic web shattered like brittle glass. Without the dominating will of their commander, the surrounding Xenos swarm devolved into a chaotic, mindless frenzy, their unified tactical perfection collapsing into base animal panic. The Leviathan of chitin and malice crashes to the scorched earth. With the death of the Hive tyrant, a violent psychic shockwave tears through the local immaterium. This is the synaptic backlash, an unseen detonation that severs the animating will of the Hive mind. Beyond the ruined blast doors, the unified roar of the swarm shatters into a cacophony of mindless shrieks. Countless bioforms, once synchronized perfectly in the terrible symphony of the Great Devourer, are instantly cast adrift in a sea of primitive rage. They turn upon one another in the corridors, reverting to feral beasts, driven only by base hunger and panic. The unstoppable tide of the Xenos Terra is broken, reduced to rabid vermin cannibalizing their own flesh in the dark. But within the heart of the slaughterhouse, there is no screaming. There is only a profound, suffocating silence. The sole disturbance in this heavy quiet is the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling lasgun barrel. Guardsman Rauth stands perfectly still at the epicenter of a macabre tableau. Around him lie the butchered remains of half a dozen Space Marines. These were the angels of death, engineered for supremacy and clad in holy ceramite, yet torn apart like wet parchment by the scythes of the Xenos warlord. The demigods bleed out upon the grated deck, their immense forms reduced to broken meat, and amidst this graveyard of giants stands a single mortal human. Rauth is miraculously unharmed. His flak armor is cracked and scorched, but his flesh remains unpierced. He is coated entirely in the pulverized dust of shattered Astartes armor and the ash of incinerated Xenos ichor. He breathes the airborne remains of better men. This moment marks the conclusion of his 463rd combat drop. A suffocating weight settles upon his shoulders, far heavier than the physical exhaustion aching in his bones. It is the crushing realization of his own unnatural survival. The existential horror of his resilience washes over his mind in a freezing tide. He cannot fathom why the master of mankind has spared him, while the absolute pinnacle of human evolution lies slaughtered at his feet. There is no glory to be found in this victory. There is only a hollow void where his spirit used to reside. He stares at the monstrous corpse of the tyrant, feeling no triumph, only the dull ache of a soul that stubbornly refuses to perish. The quiet of the chamber is a temporary illusion, a fleeting breath between the endless cycles of galactic destruction. Far above the ruined dome, the heavy vibrations of descending assault craft begin to tremble through the planetary crust. The vast, unfeeling machinery of the Imperium is coming to claim the battlefield. The lords of the Astra Militarum and the merciless scribes of the Administratum will soon descend into this crypt. They will meticulously catalogue the dead, harvest the sacred gene seed of the fallen Astartes, and reclaim whatever living assets remain. Rauth knows they will find him standing exactly where he is, a perfectly functioning tool ready to be gathered up by the endless bureaucracy of war and fed straight back into the grinder. When the void ships of the Holy Ordos and the Departamento Munitorum finally pierced the atmospheric ash weeks later, they did not come to rescue heroes. They came for the holy genocide of the fallen Adeptus Astartes. What the reclamation teams found within the charnel house of the ruins defied all Imperial logic. There, sitting amidst the shattered ceramite and butchered flesh of the Emperor's own demigods, was the mortal guardsman Rauth. He did not speak when the stormtroopers leveled their hellguns at his chest. He offered no resistance when the inquisitorial agents surrounded him with force halberds humming with lethal tension. In the grim calculus of the Imperium, a baseline human surviving a nightmare that had slaughtered a full squad of Space Marines was not a cause for celebration. It was a statistical impossibility that screamed of warp taint, dark pacts, or abyssal heresy. The surviving mortal was an immediate threat to the spiritual quarantine of the sector. There would be no medals pinned to his battered chest. Instead, Rauth was violently seized, stripped of his blood-crusted uniform, and locked in heavy adamantium shackles. He was treated not as a surviving loyalist, but as a highly volatile artifact of the arch-enemy. Dragged into the cold belly of an inquisitorial black ship, he was cast into a null cell designed for rogue psychers and demonic host bodies. Absolute sensory deprivation became his new reality. The cell was devoid of light, of sound, and of the very warmth of human existence. Gagged by silence and blinded by the dark, the true torment of his survival took root within his fracturing mind. Rauth did not fear the oppressive darkness of the ship. He welcomed the prospect of execution, praying for the cleansing kiss of a bolt shell to end his endless watch. He wanted to die. He yearned to join his fallen comrades in the dust of the shattered city, to claim the eternal rest that the Master of Mankind promises to those who spend their lives in his name. Every breath he drew felt like a blasphemous theft from the dead. The fallen had earned their peace through the ultimate sacrifice, yet the uncaring universe had cruelly denied him that same grace. He was a ghost, trapped in living flesh, forced to endlessly replay the slaughter of demigods in the absolute blackness of his solitary confinement. The interrogators of the Ordos probed his mind and his blood with merciless invasive rites. They scoured his soul for the slightest hint of chaotic corruption or Xenos contagion. They found nothing but the broken remnants of a deeply traumatized soldier who only wished for the Emperor's peace. Yet the Inquisition lacks the capacity for mercy, and a claim of innocence proves nothing to a paranoid empire. He remained an anomaly, a terrifying variable that could not be easily categorized by the rigid dogmas of the Holy Ordos. Refusing to summarily execute an anomaly that could yet prove a useful subject for the Ordos, and unwilling to release a man who had witnessed the catastrophic failure of the Emperor's angels, the Inquisitors absolved themselves of the burden. They compiled his heavily redacted mission logs, stamped his living form with the sigil of indefinite quarantine, and prepared to relegate his destiny back to the macro ledgers of the Departamento Munitorum. While the silent captive awaited judgment in the dark of his cell, his destiny had already been translated into the cold binary of an astropathic choir. Across the lightless gulf of the void, the data, ghost of his service record, was cast into the insatiable maw of the Departamento Munitorum. Here, upon the throne world and its vassal administrative hubs, the true master of the Imperium is revealed. It is not the bolter or the chainsword that holds the creeping dark at bay, but the endless grinding wheel of macro bureaucracy. Picture the logic, Shrines, vast cathedrals of brass and glass where the air is thick with the scent of ozone and rotting parchment. Millions of blind scribes toil in the gloom, their withered hands bound to autoquills that twitch and scratch in perpetual agony. They sit amidst mountains of vellum so immense that avalanches of forgotten histories routinely crush the unwary. Ancient cogitators, housed in monolithic iron chassis, process the ceaseless tide of casualty reports from a million bleeding worlds. Within these suffocating halls, human life possesses no intrinsic value. A guardsman is merely a numeral, a localized expenditure of biological currency traded against the tactical gains of the eternal war. The Imperium does not run on hope or valor. It runs entirely on the grim mathematics of predicted attrition. Every battle plan, every crusade, every defensive line is calculated against a permitted percentage of acceptable slaughter. The ledgers demand blood, and the equations are balanced by the dead. Then came the file of the silent survivor. It descended into the sorting matrices of the munitorum like a droplet of poison in a stagnant pool. 463 combat drops, 0 squad casualties, 0 personal injuries. The logic engines groaned, their machine spirits agitated by the paradox injected into their sacred streams. To the pale, faceless clerks of the administratum, peering through thick magnoculars at the scrolling green runes, this record was a horrific impossibility. In a galaxy where survival is measured in minutes, a mortal man who walks unscathed through 1,000 hells is not a hero. He is a mathematical anomaly. He is a physical contradiction of the foundational axioms that govern the master of mankind's realm. If a soldier can survive such absolute devastation without a single scratch, then the calculated mortality rates are fundamentally flawed. If the attrition models are flawed, then the tithes are incorrect. If the tithes are incorrect, the logistical foundation of the entire segmentum is thrown into perilous disarray. The clerks did not see a testament to unparalleled martial skill or divine favor. They saw a highly dangerous corrupted data file, a contagion of luck that threatened to unravel the absolute certainty of their ledgers. Whispers echoed through the canyons of parchment as high adepts analyzed the mathematical heresy of his continued existence. The survivor was no longer just a man in a cell, but a living, breathing flaw in the grand design of the Imperium itself. To the Adeptus Administratum, mathematics is not merely a tool of measurement, but the very architecture of reality. The great ledgers of the Departamento Munitorum are treated as sacred texts, written in the blood of trillions and bound in the skin of martyred worlds. Within these endless echoing data crypts, a single mortal life is nothing more than a fraction, a negligible rounding error in the grand tithes that sustain the Emperor's decaying realm. When the pale, shivering scribes of the lower tiers first beheld the service record of Guardsman Rauth, they did not see a triumphant hero of the Imperium. They saw a mathematical impossibility that threatened to tear down the pillars of their dogmatic universe. The file recorded 463 orbital combat drops. It detailed 463 descents into the ravening maws of Xenos swarms, heretic uprisings, and demonic incursions. Clad only in the standard issue spun plastoid of munitorum flak armor, gripping a lasgun forged by the lowest bidder of a forgotten forge world, Rauth had emerged without a single registered laceration. To a common layman, this survival is the Emperor's grace made physical manifest. To the unblinking masters of the Administratum, it is an absolute abomination. The algorithmic prophecies of the Tactica Imperialis dictate a fixed, unyielding attrition rate for all Astra Militarum deployments. Flesh is expected to fail, armor is expected to breach, blood must be spilled in exact, predictable quantities to justify the ceaseless, grinding conscription of a million hive worlds. If the munitorum formally acknowledges that a mortal man can survive 463 drops without a scratch, they must concede that their casualty projections are intrinsically flawed. If the casualty projections are flawed, then the mandated planetary tithes of the entire sector have been calculated upon false premises. If the tithes are false, the logistics of 1,000 ongoing wars are mathematically invalid. It is a conceptual contagion that would rapidly unravel the bureaucratic sanity of a sprawling, rotting empire. To accept Rauth's survival is to accept the unpredictable mutations of chaos into the rigid, unforgiving machinery of Imperial order. The Administratum does not tolerate the unpredictable. Perfection in a mortal soldier is not viewed as a miracle, but as a severe statistical heresy. In the dim, incense-choked halls of the High Scriptorium, a terrifying consensus began to take shape among the mechanical minds of the overseers. The ledger is infallible. The sacred mathematics handed down by the founders of the Imperium cannot possibly contain an error. Therefore, it is the physical universe that has made a grotesque mistake. Reality itself has deviated from the holy parchment, and reality must be forcibly realigned. A man who defies the absolute math of death is a man who simply must not exist. The staggering weight of this realization moved steadily upward through the sprawling hierarchy of the Adeptus Terra. Countless autoquills scratched furiously across stretched vellum, drafting the fatal equations that would erase this anomaly from the galactic record. The data was purified, aggregated, and carried by lobotomized cherubim into the darkest, most heavily augmented sanctums of the data lords. There, beneath the oppressive hum of ancient cogitators, the Logis adepts prepared to pass their judgment upon the man who had the sheer audacity to survive. To the masters of the Administratum, reality is not defined by flesh and blood, but by the infallible weight of ink upon parchment. Within the planetary vaults of the Departamento Munitorum, billions of lives are weighed, measured, and discarded every single hour. When the towering cogitator banks finally processed the anomalous file of Private Nemen Rauth, the vast machine spirit of the bureaucracy recoiled in mathematical disgust. A mortal man surviving 12 years of continuous, unremitting deployment on the galaxy's most lethal battlefields was simply absurd. To acknowledge his continued survival would be to admit a fatal flaw in the actuarial tables of the holy ledgers. The Logis adepts, blind to the mud and the blood of the front lines, convened in their silent data shrines to render an emotionless verdict. A statistical impossibility cannot exist within the Emperor's perfect design. Therefore, it was decreed with absolute, chilling certainty that Private Rauth did not exist at all. The anomaly was brutally diagnosed as a catastrophic clerical error. With the mechanical, rhythmic scratching of an autoquill across dry vellum, 12 agonizing years of desperate heroism were neatly erased from history. These high scribes did not see a scarred veteran who had bled repeatedly for the Golden Throne. They saw only a misplaced integer, a rogue data point that needed to be surgically excised to satisfy the grand equation of the eternal war. The mechanism of Imperial historical revisionism is a terrifying weapon, swifter and far more absolute than any executioner's chainsword. By official edict, the Administratum reached back through the murky annals of time to correct the offensive discrepancy. They retroactively declared Private Nemen Rauth killed in action. His demise was officially recorded as having occurred during his very first atmospheric combat drop, 12 standard years prior. All subsequent commendations, medical evaluations, and combat logs attached to his identification tag were reclassified as systemic hallucinations generated by a corrupted logic engine. His true name was unceremoniously struck from the holy regimental rolls. His biometric signatures were systematically purged from the databanks of the Medici cohorts. The meager daily allocation of corpse starch rations bound to his serial number was instantly and permanently cancelled. In the omniscient eyes of the Adeptus Terra, the guardsman was annihilated not by a traitor's artillery shell, but by a stroke of bureaucratic perfection. He had been legally, officially, and utterly rendered into nothingness. Yet beneath the uncaring gaze of the cold stars, The scarred meat of the man continued to draw breath. Rauth was transformed into a phantom, trapped within the battered flak armor of the Astra Militarum. He possessed no rank, no regiment, and absolutely no legal right to exist within the borders of the Imperium. The vast, grinding logistical machinery of humanity had pronounced him a rotting corpse, leaving him totally untethered from the empire he had sworn to protect. An officially dead man requires no sleep, receives no reinforcements, and is owed no salvation. Only unending duty remains for a living ghost of the trenches. Unburdened by the fragile mortal concepts of hope or a future, the walking dead must invariably pick up his lasgun and march back toward the endless fire. The rusted iron door of the holding cell swings open for the final time. The man who was once guardsman Rauth steps into the harsh lumen light. He is met not by a firing squad, nor by a commissar wielding a bolt pistol. In the suffocating grip of the Adeptus Administratum, bureaucratic logic is a cold and absolute master. Rauth has been officially recorded as a casualty of war. The machinery of the Imperium dictates that one cannot execute a corpse. One cannot award commendations to a ghost. One cannot grant a discharge or a pension to a man who ceased to exist on munitorum parchment a lifetime ago. Therefore, Rauth is neither punished nor saved. He is simply processed. Rough hands strip away the tatters of his regimental uniform. They peel away the faded heraldry, the scorched unit markings, and the blood-stained aquila that tethered his soul to a brotherhood long reduced to ash. The legacy of his homeworld is erased in an instant. In its place, he is handed a suit of blank flak armor. The plating is dull, unpainted, and entirely devoid of insignia or rank. Into his calloused hands is thrust a standard pattern lasgun. Its dark casing is smooth and unremarkable, surgically stripped of any serial number or Forge World stamp. He is an anomaly erased by the system, reborn as a blank slate of pure violence. He is no longer a soldier of the Astra Militarum. He is merely a weapon with a heartbeat. Without a single spoken word, the nameless phantom is marched toward the colossal embarkation decks. He is shoved into the rusted belly of a Leviathan mass conveyor, packed tight amongst tens of thousands of other silent souls. The titanic thrusters ignite, carrying the colossal vessel out of orbit and into the freezing void. Its destination is the bleeding scar in reality known as the Eye of Terra. There, on cursed front lines that drown daily in the warp-tainted blood of martyrs, he will be fed into the eternal meatgrinder of the arch-enemy. Herein lies the ultimate tragedy of the 41st millennium. In a galaxy that demands relentless sacrifice, the greatest curse a mortal man can bear is absolute resilience. The Imperium is a titanic engine fueled by the lives of the willing and the damned. It functions only because its countless billions of subjects are expected to die in its defense. To survive, to endure against all mathematically impossible odds, is an affront to the fundamental nature of this dark era. The man who was Rauth refused to perish when the universe commanded his demise. For his stubborn defiance, he is condemned to a punishment far worse than oblivion. He is trapped forever in an unending loop of suffering and survival. He is a ghost haunting the mud and blood of 1,000 forgotten trenches. He possesses no name to be remembered in the great archives. He has no grave to be sanctified, and no soul to be mourned by the living. He is condemned to fight until his mortal flesh finally shatters, until the stars themselves burn down to cinders in the sky. And still, the endless march of humanity goes on. Millions of heavy boots strike the iron deck in perfect, inescapable unison. They step forward into the encroaching dark, pounding out a rhythm of perpetual war that echoes endlessly into the uncaring void.